biting winter wind whipped through the narrow alleyways of downtown Los Angeles, bringing an unusual and bitter cold that even the locals couldn't remember experiencing before. In one of these alleys, partially hidden behind a dumpster, sat James Wilson, a decorated Marine veteran who once stood proudly in formation but now huddled against the unforgiving elements. His weathered military jacket, still bearing the faded emblem of the Marine Corps, was pulled tight around his broad shoulders. The jacket had seen him through 3 tours in Afghanistan, but now it served as his only barrier between life and death on these frozen streets. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same jacket that once represented his strength now symbolized how far he had fallen. Streams of people hurried past the alley's entrance, their faces buried in their collars, their steps quickening as they caught glimpses of the homeless veteran in their peripheral vision. They were experts at the urban dance of avoidance. A quick turn of the head, a sudden interest in their phones, anything to avoid acknowledging the human being seeking shelter from the cold. James watched them through eyes that had once scanned distant horizons for threats, now studying the indifferent faces of his fellow Americans. Each person who passed represented another moment of invisibility, another reminder of how the world had forgotten men like him. The Medal of Honor he'd earned overseas now lay hidden in the bottom of his worn backpack, along with the last remnants of his former life. The temperature continued to drop as night approached. James could see his breath forming clouds in the dim light, a sight that transported him back to the mountains of Afghanistan, where the cold had been just as merciless. But back then, he'd had his unit, his brothers in arms. Now, he had only memories and the occasional kindness of strangers to keep him going. A young woman stopped briefly at the alley's entrance, her hand hovering over her purse. For a moment, James felt a flicker of hope, not for money, but for simple human acknowledgement. But like so many others before her, she hurried away, leaving only the echo of clicking heels against the concrete. The nearby church bells tolled 6 times, signaling the arrival of evening. James knew the temperature would plummet further once darkness fully settled in. He had to make a decision: stay in this relatively sheltered spot, or try to make his way to the overcrowded shelter 6 blocks away. Experience had taught him that by this hour, the shelter would likely be full, turning away even veterans like himself. His joints ached as he shifted position, a combination of old combat injuries and the unforgiving cold. The silver dog tags around his neck clinked softly, a sound that used to fill him with pride but now served as a metallic reminder of everything he'd lost. He tucked them back inside his jacket, close to his heart, where they'd stayed for the past 15 years. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the city's towering buildings, James pulled out a small, tattered photo from his breast pocket. In it, a younger version of himself stood proudly in his dress blues, surrounded by his fellow Marines. They all wore confident smiles, unaware of the challenges that civilian life would bring. He carefully returned the photo to his pocket, protecting one of his few remaining possessions from the elements. The night grew darker, and the cold became more intense. James pulled his knees closer to his chest, trying to conserve what little body heat remained. The sounds of the city continued around him: car horns, distant sirens, the occasional burst of laughter from the bar around the corner. But in his little corner of the alley, James Wilson, decorated Marine veteran, remained invisible to the world. Another shadow in a city that had forgotten its heroes. Little did he know, as he braced himself for another bitter night on the streets, that fate was about to take an unexpected turn. Sometimes, help comes from the most unexpected places, and tomorrow would bring an encounter that would change not only his life but the lives of countless veterans across the country. Before James found himself in that frozen alley, he had lived a life that embodied the very essence of service and sacrifice. His story began in the rolling hills of Montana, where as a young man, he'd stood tall and proud the day he took his oath to defend his country. The events of September 11th had stirred something deep within him, a calling that would define the next decade of his life. His first tour in Afghanistan came in 2008, where the harsh terrain and unforgiving climate tested every ounce of his training. The mountains loomed like ancient guardians, watching as James and his unit navigated treacherous paths and conducted missions that would later fill classified reports. He learned quickly that the real challenge wasn't just the enemy, it was maintaining humanity in a place where death lurked around every corner. During his second tour in 2010, James distinguished himself as a natural leader. His unit relied on his steady hand and calm demeanor during the most chaotic moments. He had a gift for making split-second decisions that saved lives, earning him the respect of both his superiors and the men under his command. But with each life saved came the burden of those he couldn't save, faces that would later haunt his dreams. The third tour in 2012 was supposed to be his last. James had already given more than most, but duty called again. This time the war had changed. The enemy was more sophisticated, the stakes higher. It was during this tour that the incident occurred, the one that would eventually lead him to that cold alley years later. Their convoy had been ambushed in a narrow valley. The explosion from an IED flipped the lead vehicle, and suddenly the air was filled with the crack of gunfire. James's training kicked in automatically. He pulled 3 wounded Marines to safety, administered emergency first aid, and coordinated a defense that lasted for hours until support arrived. His actions that day earned him a Silver Star, but the cost was steep. The physical wounds healed, the shrapnel scars, the broken ribs, the concussion, but the invisible wounds ran deeper. Back home, the nightmares began. Simple things became overwhelming: crowded places, sudden noises, even the 4th of July celebrations he once loved. The VA diagnosed him with severe PTSD, but the waiting list for treatment seemed endless. James tried to maintain a normal life. He had a job at a security firm, an apartment, even a girlfriend who tried to understand his struggles. But the memories of war didn't stay neatly contained in therapy sessions. They leaked into every aspect of his life, poisoning relationships and making even basic tasks feel impossible. The flashbacks came without warning. A car backfiring would transform a peaceful street into that ambushed convoy. The smell of diesel fuel could trigger panic attacks that left him gasping for air in parking lots. Sleep became his enemy, filled with vivid recreations of moments he desperately wanted to forget. His girlfriend left first, unable to handle the emotional walls he'd built. The job followed shortly after. Too many missed days, too many moments when the past overwhelmed the present. The apartment went next, and with it, his last grip on the normal life he'd tried so hard to maintain. The VA prescribed medications, but without stable housing, maintaining a proper regimen became impossible. His military training had prepared him for many things, but not for navigating the Byzantine system of veteran services while battling his own demons. Each application for help seemed to require another form, another waiting list, another disappointment. The streets became his new reality, a battlefield of a different kind. His military discipline helped him survive where others might have given up. He learned which shelters were safest, which soup kitchens served the best meals, which public bathrooms could be used to maintain some semblance of dignity. But with each passing month, the proud Marine who had once led men in combat found himself fading away. His family tried to help at first, but James's pride and shame kept them at arm's length. He couldn't bear to let them see what he'd become. The same determination that had made him an excellent Marine now prevented him from accepting help, convinced that he should be able to fight this battle alone. Time on the streets had a way of wearing down even the strongest spirit. James watched as his fellow homeless veterans succumbed to addiction, mental illness, or simply gave up. He fought against following the same path, clinging to his military values even as society seemed to have forgotten the promises made to those who served. Now, huddled in that alley, as winter tightened its grip on the city, James Wilson was just another statistic. One of the thousands of veterans who had fallen through the cracks of a system meant to protect them. His Silver Star and the commendations that accompanied it might as well have been ancient history, buried under layers of trauma, disappointment, and survival. But even in his darkest moments, James maintained his military bearing. His jacket might be worn, but it was still clean and properly buttoned. His facial hair, though full, was neatly trimmed using whatever resources he could find. These small disciplines were his last connection to the man he used to be, a reminder that somewhere beneath the hardship, the Marine still existed. As the streetlights flickered to life in the growing dusk, a black SUV pulled up to the curb near a bustling film set. The door opened, and Clint Eastwood stepped out, his weathered face wearing the same determined expression that had become iconic over his decades in Hollywood. He had just wrapped up a long day of directing, and his mind was already drifting toward tomorrow's scenes. The legendary actor and director pulled his jacket closer against the unusual cold, nodding to crew members as they broke down equipment for the night. At 93, most men would have long since retired to a life of leisure, but Clint had always marched to the beat of his own drum. His military service in the 1950s had instilled in him a work ethic that age couldn't diminish. Something caught his eye as he walked toward his car, a slight movement in the shadows of a nearby alley. Years of acting in westerns had taught him to notice details others might miss, and something about this particular movement seemed deliberate, controlled. Despite his security team's presence, Clint found himself drawn toward the alley. As his eyes adjusted to the dimness, he saw a man sitting against the wall. But it wasn't the typical slouch of someone who had given up. Even in repose, this man maintained what every military person would recognize, the unmistakable posture of someone who had served. Back straight, shoulders squared, despite the obvious hardship written across his face. Clint paused, his hand resting on the brick wall. His security details shifted uncomfortably, but he waved them back. There was something else about this man that demanded attention. A Marine Corps tattoo visible on his wrist. The ink faded, but the globe and anchor still proud against his skin. It was the same symbol Clint had seen countless times during his own service years. The homeless veteran noticed Clint's presence, but didn't immediately react. His eyes, sharp despite his circumstances, took in the situation with military precision. Recognition flickered across his face. After all, who wouldn't recognize Clint Eastwood? But he remained composed, maintaining his dignity even in his desperate situation. What struck Clint most wasn't the man's recognition of him, but rather the way he subtly adjusted his position, squaring his shoulders even more. It was an unconscious gesture that spoke volumes, muscle memory from years of service, the ingrained respect for authority that never quite leaves a military man. The jacket the man wore caught Clint's attention next. Though worn and weathered, it was clearly a military issue, and despite the harsh conditions of street life, it was kept as clean as circumstances would allow. The way it was buttoned even now spoke of military precision. This wasn't someone who had lost his way. This was a warrior who had been left behind. A sudden gust of wind whipped through the alley, carrying with it the bitter cold that had been gripping the city. The veteran's hands, calloused and weathered, instinctively pulled his jacket tighter. As he moved, something metallic glinted in the dim light. Dog tags, their silver surface catching the glow of nearby streetlights. Clint's mind raced back to his own time in uniform. Though he had served in peacetime, he had never forgotten the brotherhood of service, the unspoken bond between those who had worn their country's uniform. Here was a man who had clearly given more than most, now reduced to seeking shelter in an alley. The security team shifted again, more urgently this time. They were used to their client's independent streak, but standing in a dark alley wasn't part of their standard protocol. Yet Clint remained still, his gaze fixed on the veteran. Years of directing had taught him to read people, to see the stories written in their faces and posture. This man's story was one of honor, sacrifice, and a system that had failed him. As if sensing the weight of the moment, the veteran finally looked up, meeting Clint's gaze directly. In that moment, a silent understanding passed between them, one serviceman to another, transcending the vast gulf between their current circumstances. The veteran's eyes held no plea for help, no desperate request for assistance. They held only the quiet dignity of a warrior who had given everything for his country. For Clint Eastwood, who had spent decades telling stories that mattered, this seemed like a moment scripted by fate itself. But unlike the movies he was famous for, this was no actor in makeup, no carefully crafted scene. This was real life, with real stakes playing out in a cold alley on a winter evening. The distant sound of city traffic filled the silence between them, but neither man moved. It was as if they were frozen in a tableau. The legendary actor and director, still commanding respect at 93, and the homeless veteran, maintaining his military bearing even in the depths of hardship. Two men from different worlds, connected by the common thread of service to their country. In that moment, as Clint Eastwood stood in that alley, he knew that this chance encounter would lead to something important. He had always believed in the power of individual action, in the responsibility of those who could help to do so. As he took a step forward, his decision was already made. This wouldn't be just another passing moment of sympathy. This would be the beginning of something much bigger. Semper Fi. Clint's voice cut through the evening air, the Marine Corps motto serving as both greeting and acknowledgement. The veteran's response was immediate, almost instinctive, his reply of "Ura," coming from years of ingrained tradition, even before he fully processed who was speaking to him. Clint moved closer, his security detail maintaining a respectful distance but remaining vigilant. The veteran, James Wilson, started to rise, that deeply ingrained military courtesy compelling him to stand in the presence of someone he respected, but Clint waved him down with a gentle gesture. "Mind if I join you for a moment?" Clint asked, his voice carrying the same quiet authority that had commanded attention on movie sets for decades. James nodded, shifting slightly to make space in his small corner of the alley. The contrast was stark, one of Hollywood's most legendary figures sitting on a cold concrete floor next to a homeless veteran. "You served?" James asked, though it wasn't really a question. There was something in the way Clint carried himself, a familiar bearing that spoke of military service. Even at his age, it showed in his posture, his movements, the way he assessed his surroundings. "Army 1951, Clint replied, settling himself against the wall. "Swimming instructor at Fort Ord. Nothing like your service, I expect." He gestured toward James's jacket with its combat patches. "Afghanistan?" James nodded, his fingers unconsciously tracing the worn edges of his sleeve. "3 tours. Last one ended in 2012. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Things weren't the same after that. The conversation lulled for a moment, both men understanding that some experiences didn't need to be put into words. The distant sound of traffic and the hum of the city filled the silence, but in that alley, 2 men from vastly different worlds found common ground in their shared understanding of service. "You know," Clint began, his voice taking on the thoughtful tone that had delivered so many memorable lines over the years, "I've been thinking lately about what we owe each other. Not just as veterans, but as Americans." He turned slightly to face James more directly. "I've had a long, fortunate life, made more money than I could ever need, but seeing you here..." James stiffened slightly, his pride visible in the set of his shoulders. "I'm not looking for handouts, sir. I just..." He trailed off, the weight of his circumstances hanging heavy in the air. "No," Clint agreed, "you're not. And that's exactly what I'm talking about. You've got more dignity sitting here in this alley than most people have in their entire lives. But this isn't right. This isn't how we should treat our warriors." The veteran's hands clasped together, his knuckles whitening slightly. "System's broken," he said simply. "Too many of us. Not enough help. Some guys have it worse than me." Clint's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "Maybe. But right now, I'm talking to you, and I've learned in my life that sometimes the biggest changes start with just one person helping another." James looked at him skeptically. "With all due respect, sir, I've heard a lot of promises. People say they want to help, but..." He gestured at his surroundings, letting the scene speak for itself. "I'm not people," Clint replied, a hint of his trademark intensity showing through. "And I'm not making promises. I'm stating facts. You and we're going to figure this out. Tonight." The veteran's expression remained guarded, years of disappointment having taught him to be wary of sudden offers of help. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why me? There are thousands of vets out there in the same situation." Clint was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "Because sometimes life puts you in the right place at the right time. Because I believe in doing what's right, not what's easy. And because every single one of those thousands of vets deserves help, but right now you're the one in front of me." The winter wind gusted through the alley again, and James pulled his jacket tighter. Clint noticed the gesture and made his decision. "First things first, we need to get you somewhere warm, then we can talk about what comes next." "I can't," James began, but Clint cut him off with a raised hand. "You can, and you will. Consider it an order from a senior service member, if that makes it easier. A slight smile crossed his face. I might have just been a swimming instructor, but I'm still pulling rank. For the first time that evening, James smiled too, a small hesitant expression, but genuine. Yes, sir, he replied, the familiar military response coming naturally. As Clint stood, extending a hand to help James up, neither man fully realized that this moment would soon become more than just one veteran helping another. It would spark a movement that would change thousands of lives and force America to confront how it treated its warriors. But for now, in that cold alley, it was simply about two men who had worn their country's uniform, separated by decades and circumstances, but united by the common bond of service. As they walked toward Clint's waiting car, the security team falling in around them, the first steps of a remarkable journey were being taken. The neon lights of the city cast long shadows behind them, but for James Wilson they illuminated a path forward, one he hadn't dared hope for just hours before. Sometimes, he would later reflect, help comes from the most unexpected sources, but it always comes from someone who cares enough to stop and take action. The interior of the all-night diner was a stark contrast to the frozen alley they'd left behind. Steam rose from fresh cups of coffee as Clint and James sat across from each other in a quiet corner booth, the fluorescent lights casting a warm glow over their conversation. The late-night staff kept their distance, respecting the privacy of their famous customer and his unusual companion. "Combat medic?" Clint asked, his eyes fixed on James as the veteran wrapped his weathered hands around the warm coffee mug. The question wasn't just casual conversation. There was something in James's demeanor, the way he had automatically checked the exits and scanning positions when they entered, that spoke of specialized training. James nodded, taking a careful sip of his coffee. "Started as regular infantry, but we were short on medical personnel. After I helped patch up some guys during an ambush, they sent me for additional training. Turned out I had a knack for working under pressure." "Tell me about that," Clint prompted, his director's instinct sensing there was more to the story. He'd spent decades studying people, learning to read the weight of unspoken words in their expressions. James was quiet for a moment, his fingers absently tracing the rim of his coffee cup. "There was this day in Kandahar province. Our convoy hit an IED, bad one. 3 vehicles damaged, multiple casualties. We were taking fire from 3 directions and I had wounded men scattered across 100 yards of ground." He paused and Clint waited patiently, understanding that some stories needed time to be told. "I don't remember much of what happened next. Training just kicked in. I remember running from casualty to casualty, applying tourniquets, calling in coordinates for evacuation. 12 men were critically wounded that day." "And you saved them all," Clint stated, not as a question but as a recognition of fact. "All 12 made it home," James confirmed quietly. Youngest was 19. Had a picture of his newborn daughter in his helmet. He lost his leg, but he made it back to hold that baby. The weight of those lives saved hung in the air between them. Clint leaned back, studying the man before him with new understanding. 12 families still have their sons, their husbands, their fathers because of you. Yet here you are, sleeping in an alley. James shifted uncomfortably. Lots of good men ended up on the streets. The stuff we saw over there, it changes you. Coming back, trying to fit into normal life. Some of us couldn't make that transition. But you kept your training, Clint observed. Even now, I can see you assessing everyone who walks through that door. Old habits don't die. Can't turn it off, James admitted. Sometimes I still find myself checking people for injuries, planning treatment protocols in my head when I see accidents on the street. Last week, a kid fell off his skateboard near my alley, had a pretty bad gash on his arm. I used supplies from my med kit to patch him up before his parents could even call an ambulance. Clint's eyebrows raised. You still carry a med kit? Always. James patted his worn backpack. Basic supplies, bandages, gauze, antibiotic ointment. Old combat medics rule, never go anywhere without the ability to save a life. The revelation struck Clint deeply. Here was a man who had lost everything, his home, his possessions, his place in society, yet he still maintained the core of who he was, still carried the tools and knowledge to help others. The silver lining of darkness, Clint mused, his voice taking on the gravelly tone that had delivered so many memorable lines, is that it shows us who we really are. You lost your home, but you never lost your calling. James looked up, meeting Clint's gaze. Sir? You're still a healer, James. Still saving lives even from that alley. The world didn't stop needing men like you just because it forgot how to take care of you. The veteran's shoulders straightened slightly, a glimpse of his military bearing showing through. Doesn't change where I sleep tonight. Actually, Clint replied, it changes everything. He pulled out his phone, his expression taking on the focused look that had preceded many of his greatest directorial decisions. I think it's time we put your skills back to work, not just as a medic, but as someone who understands what other veterans are going through. What do you mean? I mean that saving those 12 men in Afghanistan wasn't the end of your mission, James. It was just the beginning. There are thousands of veterans out there fighting the same battles you've been fighting. They need someone who understands both the medical and the emotional scars of war. For the first time that night, a spark of real hope flickered in James's eyes. Not just the temporary relief of a warm meal or a night's shelter, but the possibility of purpose, of using his hard-won knowledge to make a difference again. Clint continued, his plan taking shape as he spoke. The question isn't whether you're qualified to help. The question is why we've been wasting your skills all this time. That changes tonight. As the diner's clock ticked past midnight, two men, one a legendary figure of American cinema, the other a forgotten hero of American combat, began mapping out a future that would extend far beyond their chance encounter in a frozen alley. Neither of them knew it yet, but their conversation would spark a movement that would change how America treated its veterans, one warrior at a time. The luxury hotel suite was a jarring contrast to the alley where James had spent the previous night. As Clint made phone calls from the living room area, James stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his reflection ghost-like against the city lights spread out below. His worn military jacket seemed out of place among the premium furnishings, but his posture remained straight, dignified. No, Tom, I need this done tonight. Clint's voice carried across the room as he spoke to his longtime friend at the Veterans Affairs office. I understand it's after hours. That's why I'm calling you directly. There was a pause as he listened. Yes, I know exactly who I'm vouching for. Combat medic, 3 tours, Silver Star recipient. This isn't a casual request. James turned from the window, watching as the legendary director paced the room with the same intensity he brought to his film sets. In the past hour, he had witnessed Clint Eastwood leverage decades of relationships and influence, all focused on one goal, getting immediate help for a veteran he'd met just hours ago. Got a place lined up, Clint announced, ending the call. Temporary housing facility specifically for veterans. It's not the Ritz, but it's clean, safe, and staffed by people who understand what you've been through. He paused, studying James's reaction. That's just the start. Before James could respond, Clint's phone rang again. He checked the display and answered immediately. Dr. Matthews, thanks for getting back to me so late. He listened for a moment. Yes, PTSD treatment. Combat veteran, high priority. I'll personally cover any expenses not handled by the VA. James shifted uncomfortably at this, but Clint held up a hand, silencing any protest before it could begin. The conversation continued, with Clint taking notes in a small notebook he pulled from his jacket. After a few minutes, he ended the call and turned to James. You've got an appointment tomorrow morning at 9. Top PTSD specialist in the city. She's worked extensively with combat veterans. He tore the page from his notebook and handed it to James. Address is there along with my private number. You miss that appointment, I'll come find you myself. The threat was delivered with the same intensity that had made Clint's movie characters so memorable, but there was genuine concern behind it. James took the paper, folding it carefully and placing it in his jacket pocket. Sir, I appreciate everything, but... James began, but Clint cut him off. The next words out of your mouth better not be about refusing help, he growled. Because I've got about 6 more phone calls to make and I'm not in the mood to argue with a stubborn Marine. Despite himself, James smiled slightly. I was going to say, thank you. Clint's expression softened. Save your thanks. We're just getting started." He picked up his phone again, but before he could dial, it buzzed with an incoming message. He read it quickly, his eyebrows raising slightly. "Well, seems word travels fast. Local news got wind of our little meeting in the alley. Someone from the film crew must have talked." He showed James the screen, where a grainy photo showed the two of them walking from the alley to Clint's car. The headline read, "Clint Eastwood befriends homeless veteran, story developing." "I'm sorry," James said, his military training making him instinctively apologize for causing any disruption. But Clint was already shaking his head. "Don't be. This might be exactly what we need." He began dialing again. "The media wants a story? Let's give them one that matters." Over the next hour, Clint's calls expanded beyond immediate aid for James. He contacted veteran support organizations, homeless outreach programs, and several wealthy friends who he knew would be interested in supporting veteran causes. Each conversation built upon the last, creating a network of support that grew larger by the minute. "Running Warrior Foundation?" "Yes, this is Clint Eastwood." Another call, another connection being forged. "I want to talk about expanding your housing program. I've got some ideas about combining temporary shelter with medical support and job training." James listened as the legendary actor and director worked the phone like a master strategist, each call precise and purposeful. This wasn't just about helping one veteran anymore. It was evolving into something much bigger. Finally, Clint set the phone down and turned to James. "Transportation will be here in 20 minutes to take you to the housing facility. Tomorrow, after your appointment with Dr. Matthews, we're meeting with some people who run veteran support programs. I want them to hear your story firsthand." "My story?" James asked, uncertain. "Your story," Clint confirmed. "Because what happened to you shouldn't happen to any veteran, and you're going to help me make sure it doesn't." The city lights continued to twinkle beyond the window as plans were set in motion that would ripple out far beyond that hotel suite. What had started as a chance encounter in a cold alley was transforming into a mission, one that would eventually impact thousands of lives. As James gathered his few possessions, preparing to leave for the housing facility, he caught his reflection again in the window. The man looking back at him was still wearing a worn military jacket, still carried the visible signs of his time on the streets, but something had changed. In his eyes, there was something that had been missing for a long time. Purpose. Clint watched him from across the room, seeing not the homeless veteran from the alley, but a man who had saved 12 lives in combat and was about to help save many more. The media attention that was already building would soon shine a spotlight on veteran homelessness, but the real work, the life-changing work, was just beginning. By dawn the next morning, the image of Clint Eastwood and James Wilson leaving that alley had gone viral. Social media platforms were buzzing with shares and reposts, each adding their own commentary to the powerful image of the 93-year-old Hollywood legend helping a homeless veteran. But it was what happened next that truly captured the nation's attention. The first major news network picked up the story during their morning broadcast. In an extraordinary moment captured on the streets of Los Angeles, legendary actor and director Clint Eastwood was seen reaching out to a homeless veteran. Sources close to the situation tell us the veteran has been identified as James Wilson, a decorated Marine Corps combat medic who served 3 tours in Afghanistan. Within hours, the story had spread to every major news outlet. Each new report added another layer to the narrative, as journalists began digging into James's military record. The details of his service, particularly the incident where he saved 12 of his fellow Marines under heavy fire, became a focal point of the coverage. But it wasn't just the media attention that made the story remarkable. Veterans across the country began sharing their own experiences, creating a groundswell of testimonials about the challenges they faced after returning home. Social media platforms were flooded with stories of struggle, resilience, and the desperate need for better support systems. "I served with Doc Wilson in Afghanistan," one viral post read, accompanied by a photo of a younger James treating a wounded Marine. "He saved my brother's life in that convoy ambush. Never thought I'd see him living on the streets. This is not how we should treat our heroes." The post was shared thousands of times, each share bringing more veterans forward with their own stories. The hashtag #ServedAndForgotten began trending, becoming a rallying cry for veteran advocacy groups nationwide. Local news stations began investigating veteran homelessness in their own cities, uncovering similar stories in every corner of the country. The numbers were staggering. Tens of thousands of veterans living on the streets, many of them combat veterans with distinguished service records. A veteran in Chicago posted about sleeping in his car despite having earned a Purple Heart in Iraq. Another in Seattle shared how PTSD had cost him his job, his marriage, and eventually his home. A former Army nurse in Atlanta described her struggle to access mental health services through the VA system. But among these stories of hardship, another narrative began to emerge, one of hope and action. Inspired by Clint's intervention, people began reaching out to homeless veterans in their own communities. Small acts of kindness multiplied across the country as civilians sought ways to help. Local business owners offered jobs to homeless veterans. Landlords came forward with housing opportunities. Medical professionals volunteered their services. The momentum built rapidly, fueled by the powerful image of Clint Eastwood sitting in that alley, showing that everyone, regardless of their status, could take action to help. Veterans organizations reported a surge in donations and volunteers. The Running Warrior Foundation, which Clint had contacted that first night, saw their website crash from the overwhelming response to their veteran housing program. By mid-afternoon, major corporations began joining the cause. A national hotel chain announced a program to provide temporary housing for homeless veterans. A pharmaceutical company pledged to cover prescription costs for veterans waiting for VA benefits. A major banking institution unveiled a special loan program for veteran entrepreneurs. But perhaps the most powerful responses came from veterans themselves. Those who had successfully navigated the transition to civilian life began reaching out to their struggling brothers and sisters in arms. Support groups formed spontaneously, creating networks of understanding and assistance. One video, shared millions of times, showed a group of Marines arriving at a homeless encampment in San Diego, searching for veterans among the homeless population. They carried supplies, information about support services, and most importantly, the message that their military family hadn't forgotten them. James's story became a symbol of both the problem and the potential solution. News cameras captured him entering Dr. Matthews' office for his first PTSD treatment, his military bearing evident despite his circumstances. The image resonated with viewers nationwide. Here was a warrior who had saved others, now finally receiving the help he needed. Clint's publicist was flooded with interview requests, but the Hollywood legend declined them all. Instead, he released a simple statement. "This isn't about me. It's about the thousands of veterans who served our country with honor and now need our help." James Wilson saved 12 lives in combat. How many more lives could he and others like him save if we just gave them the chance? The statement sparked a new wave of media coverage, this time focusing on the skills and potential of homeless veterans. Stories emerged of former military medics, engineers, and technicians living on the streets, their valuable abilities wasted by a system that had failed them. As the day drew to a close, the stories showed no signs of slowing down. What had started as a chance encounter in a cold alley had sparked a national conversation about veteran homelessness and the responsibility of society to those who had served. Social media metrics showed the story reaching millions of people, but more importantly, it was inspiring action. The hashtag number served and forgotten was being replaced by a new one, number serve them back, as communities across the country began organizing initiatives to help their local veterans. In less than 24 hours, a single act of kindness had grown into a movement. But for James Wilson, sitting in his temporary housing that evening, watching the story unfold on a borrowed television, the most important change wasn't the national attention or the outpouring of support. It was the realization that his story might help other veterans find their way home from their own dark alleys. 1 week after the fateful encounter in the alley, Clint Eastwood stood at a podium in front of the newly established Veterans Restoration Center. The converted hotel would now serve as a comprehensive support facility for homeless veterans, offering everything from temporary housing to medical care and job training. But it was the man standing beside him that commanded the most attention. James Wilson, now cleaned up and wearing a crisp new suit, stood with the same military bearing he'd maintained even in that frozen alley. The past week of proper rest, medical attention, and PTSD treatment had begun to restore some of his former vigor. But it was the sense of purpose in his eyes that truly marked the change. "When I found James in that alley," Clint began, his voice carrying the weight of decades of commanding audience attention, "I saw more than a homeless veteran. I saw a warrior who had saved 12 lives in combat, who still carried a medical kit in his backpack, even when he had nowhere to sleep. Today, I'm proud to announce that James will be serving as the Chief Veteran Liaison for our new outreach program." The assembled crowd, a mix of media, veterans, and community leaders, broke into applause. James stepped forward to the microphone, his combat medic training helping him maintain composure despite the attention. "A week ago, I was invisible," he began, his voice steady. "Just another homeless vet trying to survive another cold night. But I wasn't alone out there. There are thousands of veterans living on our streets right now, each with their own skills, their own story, their own potential to continue serving." The media cameras flashed as James continued, "This center isn't just about providing shelter. It's about restoring purpose. Every veteran who walks through these doors will have the opportunity to not just receive help, but to give it. We're creating a community of warriors helping warriors." The program they unveiled was revolutionary in its approach. Veterans entering the center would receive immediate medical care, mental health support, and temporary housing. But they would also be evaluated for their military skills and experience, with opportunities to assist in various aspects of the center's operations. "Former combat medics will help staff our medical clinic," Clint explained. "Military engineers will assist with facility maintenance. Veterans with administrative experience will help others navigate the VA system. This isn't charity. It's about recognizing and utilizing the valuable skills our veterans already possess." Local shelters began reporting a surge in veterans seeking help, drawn by the promise of not just receiving assistance, but having the opportunity to help others. The stigma that had kept many proud veterans from accepting aid began to fade as the program emphasized service over charity. James spent his days moving through the center, his combat medic experience proving invaluable in identifying veterans in crisis. He could spot the signs of PTSD that others might miss, could talk to fellow veterans in their own language, could bridge the gap between military and civilian life. "You know what the hardest part was?" he explained to a group of new arrivals. "It wasn't the cold or the hunger. It was feeling useless, feeling like all my training and experience meant nothing anymore. But the training never goes away. It's still part of who we are, and it's still valuable." The center's approach began attracting attention from veteran support organizations nationwide. Clint's influence helped secure funding and resources, but it was the success stories emerging from the program that truly drove its growth. A former Army engineer found sleeping in his car now supervised the center's maintenance team. A Navy corpsman who'd been living in a tent city helped establish a physical therapy program. A Marine radio operator worked in the communications center, helping other veterans connect with their families. "What we're doing here," Clint told reporters, "is reminding these warriors that their mission isn't over. They signed up to serve their country, and that service doesn't have to end just because they've taken off the uniform." The media coverage continued, but now it focused on the success stories. Veterans who had been homeless were now helping others find their way back. The center became a model for similar programs across the country, each adapting the warrior helping warrior approach to their local needs. James's own story became a powerful testament to the program's effectiveness. In just 1 week, he had gone from sleeping in an alley to helping design and implement a revolutionary approach to veteran support. His medical skills, leadership abilities, and understanding of veteran issues made him invaluable to the program's success. As the sun set on the center's first official day of operation, James stood with Clint, watching as more veterans arrived seeking help. Each one was greeted not with pity, but with respect, not just offered charity, but given the opportunity to continue serving. "You know," Clint said quietly, "when I found you in that alley, I had no idea it would lead to all this. But I should have known. Warriors like you never really stop serving. You just need the right mission." James nodded, his hand unconsciously touching the medical kit he still carried. "In combat, we never left anyone behind," he replied. Now we're bringing that same principle to the streets. No more forgotten warriors. The center's lights illuminated the growing darkness, a beacon of hope for veterans who, like James just a week ago, were searching for their way home. What had started as one man helping another had grown into a movement, proving that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of kindness. The impact of the Veterans Restoration Center's success rippled through Hollywood like a shockwave. 1 month after its opening, celebrities began showing up at the center, not for publicity photos, but with genuine offers of support. Morgan Freeman arrived unannounced one morning, sitting quietly with veterans and listening to their stories for hours. Gary Sinise, long known for his veteran advocacy, immediately pledged his foundation's support. "This isn't about charity," Clint explained to a group of influential donors gathered in the center's conference room. "It's about investment, investing in the men and women who already proved their worth to this country." James stood beside him, now comfortable in his role as the face of the program's success. The celebrity involvement brought more than just funding. Tom Hanks, after visiting the center, used his production company to create a documentary series following the veterans' journeys from homelessness to helping others. The series, titled Warriors Coming Home, became a streaming sensation, putting faces and stories to the statistics of veteran homelessness. But the most significant changes were happening at the ground level. Veterans support programs across the country began adopting the center's model of integrating former service members into their operations. The approach spread from Los Angeles to New York, Chicago to Houston, each city adapting the program to their specific needs. "What makes this different," James explained during a veterans advocacy conference, "is that we're not just treating symptoms, we're restoring purpose. Every veteran who walks through our doors knows they're not just getting help, they're becoming part of the solution." The VA took notice. After seeing the program's success, they began implementing similar peer support initiatives in their facilities nationwide. The waiting times for mental health services decreased as more veterans became involved in the treatment process, offering understanding that only those who had walked the same path could provide. Corporate America joined the movement. Major companies began creating veteran hiring programs, specifically targeted at those who had experienced homelessness. They discovered that these veterans, once given the opportunity, brought exceptional skills and work ethic to their organizations. "These men and women aren't looking for handouts," Clint told a gathering of corporate executives. "They're looking for opportunities to prove their worth again, and every single one of them has already proven they can perform under pressure most of us can't imagine." The program's success sparked legislative action. Politicians from both parties, recognizing the broad public support for veteran initiatives, began proposing bills to expand funding for veteran housing and support services. The model that started in that Los Angeles alley was becoming national policy. James's role evolved as the program grew. He traveled to cities across the country, helping new centers implement the warrior helping warrior approach. His story, from homeless veteran to program leader, inspired others to seek help and then become helpers themselves. "When I was living on the streets," he told a group of veterans at a newly opened center in Dallas, "I kept my medical kit because it was the last piece of who I was. Now I understand. We never stop being who we are. We just need the right circumstances to remind us." The media coverage shifted from focusing on the celebrity involvement to highlighting the everyday successes. Stories emerged of veterans who had gone from sleeping in cars to becoming counselors, from tent cities to teaching job skills, from park benches to program administration. Private foundations began replicating the program's approach in other areas. The model that worked so well for veterans was adapted to help other homeless populations, always maintaining the core principle of integrating program participants into the solution. 1 year after the chance encounter in that alley, Clint and James stood together at a national conference on veteran homelessness. The statistics they presented showed the program's impact. Thousands of veterans off the streets, countless others prevented from becoming homeless, and a new generation of veteran leaders emerging from the ranks of those who had been helped. This started with one simple idea, Clint told the assembled crowd. The idea that those who have fallen on hard times don't lose their value to society. Every veteran has skills, experience, and wisdom that we desperately need. Sometimes they just need someone to remember that. The conference room was filled with success stories, veterans who had found their way back from the brink and were now helping others do the same. Each one could trace their journey back to that cold night, when a Hollywood legend took the time to see the warrior beneath the circumstances. As the program continued to expand, its influence reached beyond veteran services. Other social service organizations began adopting the principle of integrating their clients into their operations, recognizing the power of restored purpose in the recovery process. What we've learned, James explained to a reporter, is that the solution to many of our social problems already exists within the people we're trying to help. We just have to create the right conditions for them to become part of that solution. The ripple effect continued to spread, touching lives far beyond the veteran community. What had started as one man helping another had grown into a movement that was changing how society approached helping those in need. As the sun set on another day at the Veterans Restoration Center, James watched new arrivals being greeted by veterans who had once been in their shoes. Each handshake, each understanding nod, each moment of connection represented another ripple in the ever-expanding wave of change that had started in that Los Angeles alley. 18 months after that fateful night in the alley, James Wilson stood before a mirror in his small but comfortable apartment, adjusting his tie before heading to work at the Veterans Restoration Center. The man staring back at him bore little resemblance to the homeless veteran who had once huddled against the cold. His eyes were clear, his posture confident, and his silver star, once hidden in his backpack, now hung proudly framed on his wall. The transformation hadn't been easy. The first few months of PTSD treatment with Dr. Matthews had been grueling, forcing James to confront memories he'd spent years trying to forget. But with each session, the weight of those memories became more manageable, less overwhelming. Recovery isn't about forgetting, Dr. Matthews had told him during one particularly difficult session. It's about learning to carry your experiences without being crushed by them. Those words had become a mantra for James, one he now shared with other veterans struggling with their own battles. The rehabilitation program had been comprehensive. Physical therapy helped heal the damage done by years of sleeping rough. Proper nutrition restored his strength. Regular medical care addressed health issues that had gone untreated during his time on the streets. But it was the mental health support that made the most profound difference. Group therapy sessions became a cornerstone of his recovery. Sitting in circles with other veterans, sharing stories of both trauma and triumph, James found a sense of brotherhood he hadn't experienced since his days in combat. The same instincts that had made him an effective combat medic now helped him support others through their darkest moments. "You know what made the difference?" he explained to a journalist documenting the program's success. "It wasn't just the medical care or the housing. It was being treated like someone who still had value, someone who could still contribute. That's what brought me back from the edge." His family relationships, long strained by his struggles, began to heal. His sister, who had spent years trying to find him, finally reconnected. His elderly parents, who had suffered in silence, not knowing if their son was alive or dead, welcomed him back into their lives with open arms and tears of joy. "I miss so much," James admitted during a family dinner, watching his young nieces and nephews play. "But dwelling on the past doesn't help. What matters is being here now, being present for the moment still to come." The nightmares that had plagued him for years began to fade. While they didn't disappear completely, they lost their power to paralyze him with fear. He learned coping mechanisms, developed strategies for handling triggers, and slowly rebuilt his sense of security in the world. His medical skills, which he had maintained even during his darkest days, found new purpose. The medical kit he had carried in his backpack was replaced by a fully stocked office at the center, where he helped assess new arrivals and coordinate their medical care. His experience as both a combat medic and a homeless veteran made him uniquely qualified to understand their needs. "Sometimes, healing physical wounds is the easy part," he told a group of medical students visiting the center. "The harder part is helping someone believe they deserve to be healed. That's where being a veteran helping veterans makes all the difference." The transformation extended beyond the physical and emotional. James began taking classes at a local college, updating his medical certifications and studying social work. His experience, combined with formal education, would allow him to help even more veterans in their journey to recovery. His relationship with Clint Eastwood evolved from benefactor and recipient to genuine friendship. The Hollywood legend regularly checked in on James's progress, not out of obligation, but out of genuine care for the man who had helped spark a national movement. "You know what impresses me most about James?" Clint told a reporter. "It's not just that he turned his life around, it's that he immediately started helping others do the same. That's the mark of a true warrior." The trauma that had once defined James's life became a tool for understanding and helping others. He could spot the signs of PTSD in new arrivals, recognize the look in their eyes that spoke of battles fought long after leaving the combat zone. His own journey through darkness helped light the way for others. Physical fitness, once a military requirement, became part of his healing routine. Regular workouts helped manage stress and maintain the strength needed for his work at the center. The discipline that had served him in the Marines now served his recovery. "Transformation isn't a destination," James explained during a veteran support group. "It's a continuous journey. Every day we choose who we want to be, how we want to live, how we want to serve." As he finished adjusting his tie and prepared to leave for another day at the center, James paused to look at his silver star. The medal reminded him not just of lives saved in combat, but of the ongoing mission to save lives here at home. The man who had once been invisible on the streets now stood as a beacon of hope for others, proving that even the darkest circumstances could be overcome with the right support and opportunity. His transformation wasn't just personal, it was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of one person helping another. Stepping out into the morning sun, James Wilson carried himself with the pride of a Marine, the compassion of a healer, and the understanding of someone who had walked through darkness and found his way back to the light. His transformation was complete, but his mission to help others transform their own lives was just beginning. 2 years after the night that changed everything, James Wilson stood in front of a classroom at the Los Angeles County Emergency Medical Services Training Center. His audience consisted of veterans transitioning into civilian medical careers, each one brought to this moment through the Veterans Restoration Center's Career Development Program. "Combat medicine taught us to work under the worst conditions imaginable," James began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived every word he spoke. "But it also taught us something else, how to stay calm when everything around us is chaos. That's a skill every paramedic needs." The certification program had been his idea, born from his own experience of rebuilding his medical career. Working with local hospitals and emergency services, he had helped design a curriculum that translated military medical experience into civilian certifications. The program had already graduated 3 classes of veteran paramedics, with a 100% employment rate. "You're not starting over," he told his students, many of whom had their own stories of struggle after leaving the service. "You're building on a foundation you already have. Everything you learned in the military, the quick thinking, the ability to work under pressure, the commitment to saving lives, it's all valuable here." Between teaching classes, James continued his work at the Veterans Restoration Center. His office, once just a small desk in the corner, had expanded to include a full medical assessment facility. Here, he could evaluate new arrivals, coordinate their care, and help them plan their own paths to recovery. The medical center he helped establish within the facility had become a model for veteran healthcare. Staffed primarily by veterans with medical experience, it provided not just physical care, but understanding that went beyond traditional medical training. Every provider had walked the path from military to civilian life, many had faced their own struggles, and all were committed to helping their fellow veterans heal. "The difference," James explained to a visiting congressional delegation, "is that our patients don't have to explain themselves. We understand the military background, the combat experience, the transition struggles. It removes barriers to care that many veterans face in traditional medical settings." His own journey from homeless veteran to program director became a roadmap for others. The steps he had taken, accepting help, pursuing treatment, updating his certifications, and finding ways to serve others, were now formalized into a program that helped other veterans rebuild their lives. The paramedic certification program was just one part of a larger career development initiative. Veterans with different military backgrounds were guided toward civilian careers that matched their skills. Military police became law enforcement officers, logistics specialists entered supply chain management, communications experts moved into emergency dispatch. Every military specialty has a civilian counterpart, James told his students. Our job is to help you make that transition, to show you how the skills you already have can create a new future. His workdays were long but fulfilling. Morning classes at the training center, afternoon consultations at the Veterans Restoration Center, and evening meetings with community partners and supporters. But unlike the exhaustion of his days on the streets, this tiredness came with a sense of purpose, of knowing that each day brought more veterans closer to their own transformation. The medical kit he once carried in his backpack had evolved into something much bigger. The center's medical facility now served hundreds of veterans, providing everything from basic healthcare to specialized trauma treatment. James had assembled a team of veteran healthcare providers who shared his commitment to serving their fellow warriors. When I was homeless, he shared during a graduation ceremony for new paramedics, I kept my medical skills sharp by helping others on the streets. Now we're helping veterans turn that same instinct, the drive to help others, into sustainable careers. His own certifications continued to expand. Beyond his paramedic credentials, he pursued additional training in trauma care and PTSD treatment. Each new certification enhanced his ability to help others, to understand their struggles, and to guide them toward healing. The success stories mounted. Former combat medics became civilian paramedics. Military nurses transitioned to emergency room positions. Veteran mental health specialists joined the center's counseling team. Each success reinforced the program's core belief. That military experience, properly translated, was valuable in civilian life. Local hospitals began actively recruiting graduates from the program, recognizing that veteran medical professionals brought unique skills and perspectives to their teams. Emergency response units particularly valued their ability to remain calm under pressure and their experience with trauma care. What we're doing here, James explained to a new class of students, is more than just job training. We're creating a network of veteran healthcare providers who understand both worlds, military and civilian. That understanding saves lives. His own journey had come full circle. From saving lives in combat, to helping on the streets, to now training others to do the same, James Wilson had found his true calling. The skills that had once made him an effective combat medic now made him an invaluable teacher, mentor, and guide for others following similar paths. As he wrapped up his class for the day, James looked out at his students, men and women who, like him, had served their country and now sought new ways to serve their communities. In their faces, he saw the same determination that had helped him climb out of that dark alley and into a new life of purpose. Remember, he told them as they prepared to leave, every life you save, every person you help, continues the mission we started in the military. We're still warriors. We just fight different battles now. The transformation from homeless veteran to program director to educator wasn't just a personal victory. It was proof that with the right support, understanding, and opportunity, every veteran could find their way to a meaningful second chance. 3 years to the day after their first encounter in that frozen alley, Clint Eastwood and James Wilson stood together at the grand opening of the 20th Veterans Restoration Center. The new facility in Houston, like the others before it, would carry forward the mission that began on that cold Los Angeles night. 3 years ago, Clint addressed the gathered crowd, his voice carrying the same commanding presence it had for decades. I found a warrior who had saved 12 lives in combat, living in an alley. Today, the program that began with that encounter has helped over 20,000 veterans find their way home. The statistics were impressive. 20 centers across the country, thousands of veterans off the streets, and countless lives transformed. But the real measure of success could be seen in the faces of those attending the ceremony. Veterans who had once been homeless, now serving as program directors, counselors, and medical professionals. James took the podium after Clint, his bearing still military precise, but his eyes reflecting the wisdom gained through years of helping others. When Mr. Eastwood found me that night, I had lost everything except my identity as a combat medic. Even homeless, I carried my medical kit, trying to help others. What I didn't realize was that holding on to that part of myself would eventually help me find my way back. The crowd included veterans from all eras, some recently homeless, others now working in the program. Among them sat Dr. Matthews, the PTSD specialist who had helped James begin his recovery journey. She had since become the National Director of Mental Health Services for all 20 centers. The power of this program, James continued, isn't in the buildings or the funding, though we're grateful for both. The power is in the understanding that every veteran, no matter their circumstances, has value, has skills, has the potential to continue serving. We just need to help them remember that. The Houston facility represented the latest evolution of the program. In addition to the standard services, housing, medical care, mental health support, and job training, it included a state-of-the-art medical training center. Here, veterans with medical experience could update their certifications and transition into civilian healthcare roles. Clint, now 96 but still commanding respect with his presence, watched with pride as James detailed the center's features. The young veteran he'd found in that alley had become not just a success story, but a leader who had helped reshape how America treated its veterans. What began as one act of kindness, Clint told reporters after the ceremony, has grown into something that will outlive all of us. That's the real legacy here, not just helping veterans today, but creating a system that will continue helping them for generations to come. The impact of the program extended far beyond the veterans it directly served. Communities around each center reported decreases in homeless populations, increases in volunteer activities, and stronger support networks for veteran services. The ripple effects touched countless lives. Local hospitals partnered with the centers, recognizing the value of veteran healthcare providers. Emergency services actively recruited program graduates, appreciating their experience with high-pressure situations. Even law enforcement agencies began seeking out veterans who had completed the program's training initiatives. We're not just solving veteran homelessness, James explained to visiting officials. We're creating a model for how society can better utilize the skills and experience of those who served. Every veteran who transforms from needing help to providing help strengthens our entire community. The ceremony concluded with a tradition that had begun at the first center, a candle lighting ceremony where veterans who had completed the program passed the flame to those just beginning their journey. The symbolism was powerful, light being passed from one warrior to another, hope illuminating the path forward. As the crowd dispersed, Clint and James took a moment to reflect on the journey that had brought them to this point. The alley where they'd met was now marked with a small plaque, reminding passers-by that sometimes the greatest changes begin with the smallest acts of kindness. "Did you ever imagine," Clint asked, "that one cold night would lead to all this?" James shook his head, touching the medical kit he still carried out of habit. "No, sir. But you taught me something that night. That sometimes all it takes is one person willing to see past circumstances to recognize potential." The legacy they had built would continue growing. Plans were already underway for more centers, more programs, more ways to help veterans transition from military to civilian life. Each success story added momentum to the movement, proving that no veteran was beyond hope. As the sun set on the Houston ceremony, casting long shadows across the new facility, James Wilson stood at attention, rendering a silent salute to the flag. He was no longer the homeless veteran from that alley, nor just the success story who had turned his life around. He had become a symbol of hope, a bridge between despair and redemption, a warrior who had found a new way to serve. The legacy of compassion that began in that Los Angeles alley would continue touching lives long after both Clint and James were gone. In centers across the country, veterans would continue helping veterans, warriors would continue guiding warriors, and hope would continue illuminating the path home for those who had lost their way. That cold night 3 years ago had proven that one act of kindness, one moment of recognition, one person willing to help, could spark a movement that would change countless lives. It was a legacy not just of compassion, but of the enduring strength of the human spirit and the unbreakable bonds of those who serve.